All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Ask the Experts. And we are going to be discussing some outside of the sandbox ways to heal and strengthen your brain, along with strategies that you can begin taking today to delay and even reduce your risk of cognitive diseases. Our guest expert is Jennifer Myers, and she is a clinical research scientist at NeuroTrack. NeuroTrack is the brain health company that's behind the DC Marvel study. She has a PhD in neuropsychology and a minor in cognitive psychology. Jennifer, what an interesting and intriguing career path. Uh, could you share with us what inspired you into this profession and maybe a couple of fun facts about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you again to everyone here on today's call or what I hope to be a conversation. So I'm actually, before I became a neuropsychologist, I was actually, and still am, a speech language pathologist. I have a medical specialization as a speech pathologist. So I've always been interested in the brain and cognition at first in terms of the context of communication, and that was where I actually interacted a lot with individuals who were diagnosed with cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease, and worked a lot in terms of, I always say, from the diaphragm up. So speech, language, swallowing, memory, organization and decision making skills, etc. And so I decided I wanted to do more because, as you all can imagine, having something like that is very life changing. And you often, as a speech language pathologist, have to also be almost a counselor and a friend, really, because there's a lot of emotional attachment to some of the aspects of communication and cognitive communication specifically. And so I went back, got my doctorate in neuropsychology to really tie in the bridge between cognition and emotion, and always had a spot for Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment in general, and kind of unique and innovative ways to think in terms of prevention and treatment of the disease. So that's what brought me here today. In terms of fun facts about myself, you can't tell with my accent, but I'm born and raised in New York, Brooklyn, New York to be specific. I am very much a city gal. I also love to bake. I would argue I have the best chocolate chip cookie this side of Mississippi, but I'm willing to be challenged. And then another fun fact about myself, I truly do love to learn. It may sound weird, but if I could be a lifelong student, I would be. And so, trying to tackle this issue with Alzheimer's disease and cognitive impairment in general is a challenge that I love because I just love learning more about things and trying to problem solve and again thinking creatively and outside of the box to address some of these health related issues.
Hmm. Oh, that's such a rich background you have, like being a New Yorker and just the also the love that you have of learning and wanting to bridge that gap between the emotional side and the cognitive side. Like that's just a really beautiful harmony there you've created, and gotta love them chocolate chips. Gotta have some of that pleasure in life. Wait, Jennifer, I guess kind of to set up maybe the conversation today. So often we hear, the words Alzheimer's disease, dementia, mild cognitive impairment. Like, are these one and the same, or what are the differences between those, if there are any?
Yes, thank you, Natalie. And it's such an important question and clarification. So, when we talk about dementia, we're talking about this umbrella term, similar to when someone speaks about heart disease. It is just a general term to talk about general symptoms or issues that are related to cognition. So, for example, thinking about things that would impact your or interfere with your daily life. So, memory issues, problem solving issues, language issues, etc. Alzheimer's disease is the most common form of dementia. It makes up about 60 to 80% of dementia cases, and it's the one that we are most familiar with. In terms of other forms of dementia, you have vascular dementia, you have Parkinson's or Lewy bodies dementia, and basically it's how the brain is affected that differentiates the different types. So when we talk about things like plaques and tangles of the brain, it's more associated with Alzheimer's disease. When we talk about blockage in the blood, we're talking about vascular dementia, et cetera, and so on. And then from there, we can even take another step below that and talk about mild cognitive impairment, which is you're having some not so typical issues or concerns about things like, again, memory, language, problem solving. But what distinguishes that from dementia or Alzheimer's disease is the fact that it's not interfering with your daily life. So, unless you actually told someone or said something, no one would be none the wiser that you're having any concerns or issues with cognition. And that's really the distinguishing factor between mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's, or cognitive impairment in general, and dementia.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I can imagine that, like you said, you could have mild cognitive impairment and not even know it, but your brain is, maybe it's something is brewing under the surface. So it's that early detection might be important there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. I, you know, we have so many baby boomers that are coming into their golden years right now. And with that, in the estimation of Alzheimer's disease expected to triple in the next like 20 to 25 years, along with, I think there's like 6 million cases of Alzheimer's disease in the US alone. It is daunting and worrisome that there is no cure. So is there reason for optimism?
There's always a reason for optimism, Natalie. There really is. But as someone, like I said, who worked directly with individuals with Alzheimer's from early stages to later stages, I understand the cause for concern. I understand, at the mention of Alzheimer's or dementia, heart racing, sweaty palms, etc., because it is a very unfortunate and incurable, as you mentioned, disease. However, there are a lot of things that have been happening, are happening, and will happen that I think provides some real optimism, and not just, oh yeah, things are looking good, but some substantial and evidence-based optimism. For example, we know that the government has funded over about $3 billion in Alzheimer's specific research, dementia specific research, and actually recently, maybe at this point 2 years ago, increased that budget by another 300 million. So they're putting money where your mouth is, so to speak, to make sure that we are addressing the issue at hand with regard to cognition in general, and more specifically Alzheimer's disease. Also, I want to note that while there is a potential increase, studies have shown that by addressing or aiming for more preventative measures and approaching Alzheimer's disease in terms of prevention, that we're seeing, to some degree, some decline. And so, just again, being very innovative, thinking outside of the box, coming up with other ideas. I think when we think about incurable disease, we automatically think, okay, well, how do we treat it? How do we prolong it? How do we, slow down the progression? Well, how do we prevent ourselves from even getting it in the first place, or developing it in the first place? Which, now that a lot more attention has been placed on the prevention factor, I think we will see a lot more trends in the opposite direction. And just overall awareness, I think will also, I'll play that into a role where physicians, other related healthcare professionals are putting more of an emphasis in cognition and taking cognitive health just as seriously as physical health, just as serious as mental health, because it is. And so when you have that increased awareness, you get that increased investment. And so we, as healthcare professionals and providers, have started to really own that responsibility of ensuring that there's early detection and measures of cognition, so that we can act as soon as possible when we see any changes or anything that may allude to impairment.
Gosh, that's so good to hear that. Like you said, they're putting their money where their mouth is with increasing the budget for research into this. That's definitely room for optimism, and just to know there are like clinical studies happening, and it sounds like there's more activity being generated toward it. Uh, yeah, and the prevention piece of it as well. I
Yeah.
know that Dr. Rudy Tanzi, he was one of the leading scientists and pioneers in the world of Alzheimer's disease. I think he found out about the ApoE genetic piece of that. And he says that I don't say curing Alzheimer's disease, I talk about eradicating it. And I just love that quote. And I'm wondering, like, are there clinical trials that you know of or research that's happening that is promising in the effort to eradicate Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah, there are tons. I know, and there's probably even more than this at this point. But going back to kind of the federal government, the National Institute of Aging has about 350 active clinical trials going on. And while I won't talk about specific trials, what I will say is the breadth of the trials have expanded and really speaks to the full continuum as we talk about Alzheimer's disease. So they have clinical trials that are based on early stage, late stage. They also have non drug interventions that they're doing clinical trials on, as well as care and caregiver interventions, which to me is one of the most important aspects because it certainly is a burden, unfortunately, to the loved ones in terms of the disease. It's not just a single person disease, it affects the whole support system. What I will also say is that the Alzheimer's Association has what they call a trial match web page where if you're interested in participating in research based on your family needs, your family history, etc., will provide you with a list of clinical trials that are going on that meet your match and needs, which I think is also important. One of the biggest issues is we're not getting the type of people we really want into the clinical trials, those who are disproportionately affected, those who have family history, and a lot of that has to do with just lack of awareness. And so there's a lot of clinical trials that are coming down the pipeline in terms of medical. So I'm assuming that some of us are aware of some of the recent meetings and clinical trials surrounding drug research, and I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit later about the different medications. I'm one that likes a more comprehensive look, so in addition to the drugs, what interventions are we providing? Shameless plug here, like digital health coaching that will help address some of the risk factors associated with Alzheimer's, and then again, those that lend itself to providing caregiver support during the time of having to support a loved one with Alzheimer's disease. So a lot of clinical trials going on, and a lot of opportunities for us as community members and stakeholders to get involved.
Jennifer, can you say where do they go to see those clinical tests?
Yes, it's called Trial Match on Alzheimer's Association website. So alz.org, which is ALZ.org, and I believe just a simple search. And I'm happy to, as we wind down with the Q&A, to actually bring up that link and share it in the chat.
Oh, awesome. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, that would be great. And, maybe a little off topic, but on topic. I recently picked up a book by Tony Robbins, and he was working with a whole team of doctors on this book called Life Force. And he's got a chapter that has so many interesting research and studies that are going on right now in the works that have been very inspiring. So just to toss out another resource in case folks are interested in doing some learning more on that. And you did mention, you touched a little bit on medication, and I am wondering, like, are there, I do know of one drug, but if you could speak to that, like, are there FDA approved medicines that are available today?
Yes, there are actually quite a few considering, but their kind of target purpose are different. So I'll break it down into kind of three buckets, if you will. Um, the drug or drugs that impact the actual disease progression or claim to change the disease progression, those that treat more cognitive symptoms surrounding the disease, and then those who treat non cognitive symptoms around the disease. So the only drug that actually is designed to change the disease progression is Aduhelm, so Aduhelm. And then in terms of FDA approved medications that treat more of the cognitive symptoms, specifically things like memory and just overall thinking, and some of these may be vaguely familiar to some, Aricept, Exelon, Namada, I think is another one. And then in terms of ones that actually treat more of the behavioral and psychological symptoms surrounding Alzheimer's disease, the one that comes to mind is Belsomra, which is Belsomra. So again, quite a few, depending on the kind of purpose or the intention of said drugs, but there's quite a few.
Mhm.
Um, Unfortunately, as I just mentioned, there's only one that is actually designed to change the disease progression as opposed to treating the symptoms, and that is the Adullum. And so there's a lot of work, again, at least 350 active trials, a good number of which that are looking at drugs in terms of changing disease progression. But I think we've also, again, going back to the importance of looking at non pharmaceutical options in terms of intervention and treatment, that really anytime you look at a disease, having both a pharmaceutical kind of component, but also a non-pharmaceutical component is important. And so we'll see in the next coming years how things check out, and hopefully this list will expand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good to know that there is the Adullam is a drug that is approved, that it kind of goes at the disease. Am I hearing that right?
Yes, Natalie.
Okay, yeah. And then otherwise, these are other drugs that treat the symptoms, not but they're not cure oriented.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. And you just along those lines of talking about some natural, maybe holistic ways to approach reducing or decreasing the symptoms. I know this might be a loaded question, so feel at ease to share like some of your higher level insights on this. But what are your thoughts about supplements? I have heard that B6, B12, and folate do help to reduce the or decrease the progression of MCI to Alzheimer's disease. Can you talk more about that or any kind of supplements you might recommend?
Yes. So, to your point, in terms of research, folic acid, B12, B6 have been shown to some degree to help the progression or to improve cognition, particularly in that MCI or mild cognitive impairment phase. What I'll say about a lot of more of the innovative treatment and even preventative strategies is that more research is needed. Oftentimes, the research is done as more of an exploratory, and so the sample size is small, or the sample size itself is not very representative of the typical people who go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. And so I would definitely say promising and would underline that, but certainly would not say, yes, absolutely take these supplements. You're going to see a change in your cognition. Simply put, we just need more research. And I don't say that as like, oh, a negative. I do say that though as it's an exciting time because we're starting to, again, and this will be a running theme with me, think outside the box. And so if we get someone or someone's to do the initial work to look at some things that we might not have initially paired with cognition, and we show some promise, that will allow more funded research to do more of the work. Because oftentimes, and now I'm speaking as a researcher, there's a little apprehension to do something new because we're worried it won't get funded. We won't get the support that we need financially or otherwise. And so when we have these studies that show a link or a connection at the very earlier surface level, it gives more of us motivation to go ahead and leap out there and investigate more. So definitely exciting times right now. And with the supplements, definitely promise.
Yeah. Yeah, I that makes a lot of sense that, just knowing there's promise in that area can like we're getting more funding for this, they can get in there, do more research on it so it's more valid. I did hear a fascinating story. I don't know if any of you remember Ray White. He was a former NFL football player back in the early 70s. Anyway, his wife was diagnosed with frontal temporal lobe dementia. So, like Jennifer, you were talking about the different types of dementia. This was the type that was deteriorating her frontal cortex. Uh, but Ray was told by his doctor that he should go ahead and find a home for her, that she wasn't going to remember his name a year from that date. But he started eating a brain healthy diet. We talk a lot about the mind diet in coaching sessions, and he started taking some of the supplements. And he also, went outside of the sandbox and had her do hyperbaric oxygen treatments. And 5 years later, fast forward, she did make improvements. She still remembered his name and she was still living at home. So, like, we're talking along the lines of innovative treatments or strategies. What are your thoughts about hyperbaric oxygen as a way of treating brain issues?
Yeah, I think it's again one of those interesting concepts that when you really think about it, it makes sense. So, in terms of hyperbaric oxygen, it actually was initially used for divers, so scuba divers who take very long, very deep dives, and so now we're seeing it. I would say last maybe decade or so, getting more prominence, getting more research backed by it in terms of its connection to improving cognition. And the reason being is it's improving your brain blood flow. It's also improving or helping to restore your brain metabolism and even the microstructure within the brain. And so, again, if you really think about it, well, all those things seem positive in terms of the context of improving cognition. If you're improving kind of the tissue or the muscle of the brain as what the brain is, in theory, it should improve its function, its efficiency, and in this way, your cognition. Um, Again, it's one of those things. While there's been a lot more research, still more research is needed. I also want to note that doing what we call HBOT or hyperbaric oxygen treatment is not something that you could just do in the comforts of your own home, right? So a lot of times it requires either a lot of equipment or expensive equipment. So while it does show a lot of promise, that versus like supplements is not as feasible of an option as, say, supplements or, get another shameless plug, health coach training or something to that effect. So I stand behind it in terms of its promise, but also recognize that in terms of feasibility, it's not one of the better forms of treatment.
Yeah. Actually, that sounds so fascinating, like how you were describing how it helps the blood flow in the brain and builds the muscle tissue there. And I think, doesn't it help with wound healing too? I think I read something.
Yes, yes, it
Yeah.
does. It does.
Yeah, so it's fascinating, but yeah, like looking at this like on a spectrum of feasibility. Yeah, like if health coaching is available, take advantage of it, because like we work on those preventative strategies and interventions that have been actually shown to support delaying or reducing risk factors. So yeah,
And
that's
Natalie, you even mentioned in the vignette that you just provided that it wasn't just the oxygen treatment, but it was a change in the diet as well.
hmm,
And I think that really highlights the importance of kind of a multimodal, multidimensional approach to cognitive health. So it's not just the nice techie, equipment and the latest trends in improving your cognition, but tried and true exercise and dieting in combination with some of these things is equally important.
yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you brought that out. Yeah, like having that multi faceted approach. That yeah, she was eating a brain healthy diet, she was taking supplements, she was probably getting just a much better overall healthy lifestyle in general. Uh,
Hmm.
yeah. And part of one of the risk factors of cognitive decline, even depression can be a risk factor. That, for women that have depression, studies show that it doubles your risk of Alzheimer's disease, and for men it quadruples their risk of Alzheimer's disease. So I know that, like, during the winter months, in a lot of coach sessions, we've talked about this idea of seasonal affective disorder. And boy, all of you, I know it's been a rough, long winter, and sometimes the weather patterns and different, like probably even for you, Jennifer, of where you live, the weather patterns might be like it's snowing today or it's cloudy here. Um, this can cause a lot of issues with, practicing, healthy lifestyle things like exercise, eating well, even social engagement. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts as a treatment being red light therapy or light therapy for that issue? Is this something that is would be helpful?
Yeah, I may have to dust off my own red light because I was not anticipating the snow outside today. But in all seriousness, again, it's one of the reasons why I went back and got my degree in neuropsychology, because of just the relationship between cognition and emotions, between cognitive health and mental health. So while depression may not be a direct risk factor in terms of Alzheimer's disease, it's the symptoms, it's the behaviors associated with depression that can lend itself to that risk. So, for example, if you're depressed, you're not going to be as likely to take care of yourself physically. You're more likely not to take care of yourself in terms of your nutrition. Your sleep patterns are going to be off, etc. And so addressing some of those moods, whether it's depression or even anxiety, is important. So I definitely think if you are someone that is impacted by the seasons or has a family history of depression, something like light therapy, while not directly impacting your likelihood of developing AD, can reduce risk such as depression, which will then lend itself to your likelihood of developing Alzheimer's disease. What I'll also say with light therapy in terms of actual cognitive impairment, sleep is associated with cognition and cognitive health as well. And what we find is when you are depressed and or have depression like symptoms, that your sleep is often disrupted. We also see this in Alzheimer's disease as well, where your sleep patterns and behaviors are more maladaptive than positive. And so something like therapy to increase your mood, to keep your mood stable, and etc., can lend itself to having, again, more positive behaviors that will, one, reduce the likelihood of cognitive impairment in general and perhaps developing Alzheimer's disease. And then in the event that you do have a cognitive impairment, like mild cognitive impairment, or go on to progress to have Alzheimer's disease, just being mindful of other things that are at play. I'll go on a slight rant here, Natalie, but I promise to wrap it up. We often think of Alzheimer's disease as a memory disease, but it's so much more, and it impacts so much more. And so by taking care of our sleep, taking care of our stress levels, taking care of our physical health, making sure that we have a strong social support system, all of those things which are often impacted by the disease, it's important to be proactive in terms of those various lifestyle focus areas, not just in preparation or not just in terms of wanting to prevent Alzheimer's disease, but just in general overall health. They're so intertwined. What you don't do for your cognitive health impact your physical, and vice versa. And I can go on and on and on, but as I said, I'll wrap it up short here.
Oh, Jennifer, I just tell me more. I'm sure everyone on this call is just loving this, how you're talking about this. It's that idea of what's, I know I say it and we've heard it, what's good for the heart is good for the brain too. And
Mm-hmm.
really opening up to those nourishing practices with not only with food, but with love in our life, with hope, with joy. All these things, they nourish us and they have a healing impact on our
Absolutely.
brains. So yeah, again, tying in that emotional piece as you do with that cognitive piece is is so vital.
Yes. And Natalie, if I may, and I'll only touch on this briefly because I am not well versed in this area, but I do know as of late in talking about light therapy, there is this um, it's what we call photobiomodulation, and so there is some work being done using light as a means to change the way that the brain reacts to damage. So semi parallel to how the HBOT or the oxygen treatment works, but instead of using oxygen, you're using light to kind of change what's the term that I'm thinking of? Um, Kind of changing the brain's response to damage in hopes of kind of getting the brain to restore itself again. So all of the brain metabolism, the microstructures that I talked about in terms of the oxygen treatment, the same could be said with this more novel light therapy or the photobiomodulation. But again, unfortunately, I am not well versed in it, so I can't speak too
Yeah.
much on it other than to say it is something that is emerging and could be just as promising as some of the other treatments we talked about.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, just anything that we can do to support our brain regenerative power on
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
So it makes me think about how stress causes that inflammation in the hippocampus, and how that kind of ties in also with, as if we can reduce that inflammation in our brain, that helps with brain metabolism. Is that right, Jennifer? Or is that?
Yeah, so all of the above, all of the above. It's just such a multi-directional, interconnected relationship. So anything that you're doing to improve your overall health is going to
Mhm.
improve your cognitive health and vice versa.
Yeah. So I just took maybe a last question. I'm picking your brain a lot today while you're here with us. But what are some concrete steps and treatments that we can take today that would greatly improve our odds?
Yes, so there's some factors that we just can't help, and I like to mention them not as a reminder that we don't have control over these things, but as a reminder that while there are some things we can't control, there are some things that we can. So age is the biggest factor in terms of Alzheimer's disease. With I think 1 in 9 at this point of people who are 65 and over who will go on to develop Alzheimer's disease. That said, we'll get the bad news out the way. That said, there are a lot of risk factors that are controllable, that are things that we can take ownership of, and a lot of them are the lifestyle focus areas that are discussed in the health coaching. So physical health, being active, being engaged physically, and whatever that looks like to you. It doesn't mean that you need to run marathons every other month, but just being mindful of how much you are active and ways that you can be active that is, and I'll underline, circle, highlight this, that is enjoyable,
Mm.
because any habit that you establish, if you don't enjoy it, it's not going to last long. Also, nutrition. So, being mindful, no pun intended, of what you eat, and making sure that your diet is reflective of one that wants to maintain and, in some degree, improve your cognitive health. Sleep and stress and social, my 3S's, those are also important. So making sure that you remain social. So things like depression can certainly start to kick in if you don't have a connection with people. It doesn't need to be a large group of people, but a small but deep group of people is just as good. Are you engaged in social activities in your communities or neighborhoods? One, we are social creatures by nature, so we need to be social. It's not a option. We need to be social. And then second, it gives you a level of accountability when you have people that are checking on you, and you have people that you can check on. So you have reasons to make sure that you live a long, healthy, prosperous life, and there's people that want you to do the same. In terms of sleep and stress, we live in a Western civilization, so a lot of things that we think of, we'll rest later. You have to do all of these things and juggle all of these things, whether it's family or work related. But being mindful that self care is very important and very valuable, and often overlooked. For those of us who are parents, we know taking care of our family, our children, can be very burdensome. Many of us are in that in between phase of not only taking care of our children, but also taking care of our parents who are now older adults. But being mindful, like when you go on the airplane and they say you put that oxygen mask on first before you help others, I would say the same rings true in terms of our cognition. You have to make sure that you are good, that you are taken care of, that you love yourself, before you try to be everything to everybody. And then sleep hygiene, being mindful of the things that take away of, rested, well, meaningful sleep. So yeah, you slept 8 hours, but if 50% of the time you were, stirring or having to get up and go back to sleep, it wasn't really restful. Yeah, you may have had 3 hours of just really great sleep, but if you're still tired and it's impacting your attention, it's impacting your memory, then was it really meaningful or quality sleep? So all of those lifestyle focus areas are things that you can do literally today, as you all well know, that can literally add years to your life, regardless of this is beyond cognition. And so it's taking advantage of the things that you do have control over, and then remembering that it is not a sprint. And so I know oftentimes we get overwhelmed by thinking we have to, recreate Rome in a day, but sometimes it's adding one little, green leafy vegetable to your meal as opposed to making your whole meal mind diet. Maybe it's walking for 10 minutes versus trying to run a 3K. So those are the things that I will say as kind of the last, treatment steps that you can do today that would improve. Always challenging yourself mentally, keeping if you don't use it, you lose it, as the saying goes in terms of cognition. So all of those things are things that can be done easily today, baby steps. And it's why we talk about it in the health coaching program, because we know it's tried and true. And I think are great. And as to kind of tie this in a final bow, medication can be important and valuable. The innovative treatments like the oxygen and light therapy can also be valuable and are promising as it relates to Alzheimer's disease. But you need to have the lifestyle focus areas also managed and in check. Those things don't work as well if the lifestyle doesn't also go with it. And so it's equally, and if I'm giving you my honest opinion, more important than some of the other treatments in terms of medications and the like.
Mm. Oh, Jennifer, gosh, that's so wonderful hearing how you describe the lifestyle factors and how, yeah, if you want to start with anything, this is something you can start right now today with. And I know in coaching sessions, a lot of times we're talking about stress in the Western society. Yeah, like how we are everybody to everything to everybody, and we lose sight of our own self-care. We put it off. I'll exercise tomorrow. And really, like how you said, you've got to put that oxygen mask on first. And these things are boosting your brain reserve. Like you're going in with a fighting chance. Like you said, right now it's 1 in 9 that will develop Alzheimer's disease. I think you said after the age of 65. So yeah, let's get fired up to boost that brain reserve, and lifestyle factors can do that. I want to make sure that I open up the floor to everyone to ask your questions. I already see one in the chat. Sandy, would you like to unmute yourself and ask this question, or I can ask it for you?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'll let you see me. My question is, what practitioner is the most qualified to diagnose mild cognitive impairment?
Great question. So I would say, so I'll start general. So physicians, neuropsychologists, psychiatrists, even geriatricians can diagnose MCI. Those who would have kind of more specialized training in terms of cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease, will likely be those who are a geriatric psychologist or physician, neuropsychologist or psychiatrist that have that they specialize in older or the elderly population. Just as some context, even though you may have a degree in neuropsychology or may be a psychiatrist, it doesn't mean that you automatically have a specialization in terms of cognitive impairment. But you do have kind of more information or more background or training, I think is a better word, than say a physician, unless they are a geriatric physician. So I would say, again, neuropsychologist, psychiatrist, or some type of geriatric psychiatrist or physician would be the best individuals in terms of diagnosis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Brandy asked a question, any genetic factors?
Specifically also with the early onset. So my mother was diagnosed at 52 with early onset, died at 65. My sister and I, twins, were getting close to the 50 and mark, and we are right now in the MC Marvel trial looking for other trials. But the early onset was a whole different beast from what we have had seen at some of the support groups. And I wonder, is there any genetic factors? Because as Natalie knows, it's a big fear of mine, and the closer I get to 50, the more I'm starting to fear just anything I think is a sign that maybe it's happening to me. So what do you know about that?
Yeah, so family history is definitely a thing as it relates to Alzheimer's. So if you have a sibling or parent that has had or does have Alzheimer's disease, you are more likely to develop, but it's not a guarantee that you will. In terms of specific genetics, the big one is the APOE dash E4 gene, so literally APOE hyphen E4. And that with that particular gene, or it's really a set of genes, but that the group of genes kind of account for anywhere between 40 to 65% of people who are diagnosed with Alzheimer's has that gene. The tricky thing about genes is you can have the gene and not develop Alzheimer's, and you cannot have the gene and also develop Alzheimer's. So while they are certainly genes associated with Alzheimer's disease, even having the gene does not mean you are guaranteed to go on and develop the gene. And I don't know if that will necessarily reduce some of the concern that you have, but I think it's important to note that just because you have biomarkers or family members with the disease, it's not a guarantee that you too will have the disease. And then I'll also point out that there are what we call deterministic genes that are related to some type of underlying, what's a good way of saying this? That are basically like rare genes that are directly related to, in this case, Alzheimer's disease. But typically, that is not; those aren't type of genes that you need to be as concerned about, if one could say that, as opposed to the APOE gene.
Yeah, we have another question here, and feel free to unmute yourself, y'all, if you have a question, or you're welcome to put them in the chat.
I'm going to quickly just, before I forget, include that link that I was talking about in terms of the trial match before
Jennifer,
I forget.
I think I put the correct one in there.
Okay.
I want to check to make sure that's the same one you have.
Systems. Yes.
So what do you do? Just raise your hand?
Yeah, well, first I'm going to get Mark's question, but yeah, if you know how to, like you might see that hand raised, that would be great. Or okay. You can do it yourself. That'll work. I'll be watching. Mark asks, would you recommend having a baseline cognitive assessment? Would you recommend having a baseline cognitive assessment performed at a certain age?
I always say the sooner the better, because then you know where you started from. But realistically, if you don't have a medical history of a family history, I should say, of Alzheimer's disease, if you don't have any significant risk factors other than you're getting older, as age is one of the big factors, I would say kind of monitoring your cognitive health at about 40 or 50 is good, because you want to know where you started. And I know we kind of jump to Alzheimer's disease, but you can, as I mentioned, have mild cognitive impairment. So you want to be mindful of any of those subtle but significant changes that are at play. If you don't have any of those kind of quote unquote major concerns, and I would push that back to about 50 to 60. Again, all dependent upon kind of are you living independently, your kind of general health status, your family history, etc. That really will dictate when, or should not dictate, but should lend itself to your decision as to when you should get a cognitive assessment. Similar to those of us who maybe have breast cancer in our family history, right? We are often encouraged to see a doctor sooner than later about something like that. So the same could be said with cognitive health. If you have a family history, if you have some concerns or certain risk factors, sooner than later is best.
Yeah, I hear a lot of folks telling me, I'm almost 50, but at 50 we have to have your colonoscopy, right? Well, I mean, it's important to check the other end too.
Yes. Top to bottom, top to bottom. And a lot of times, and I'll say this as well, you don't need a full on so a typical neuropsychological examination for cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's could be 3 hours, could be multiple visits. It's very comprehensive. You don't need to do that in terms of okay, am I cognitively intact? Am I where I need to be? A simple cognitive assessment like the MOCA or MMSE that your physician can give you, and just giving them a heads up that you would want that. 10-15 minutes is all it takes, just to give you a good idea of okay, where am I? Did it take me a little longer than I anticipated to recall those words? Did I struggle with naming certain things, etc.? So really more of a check for you that doesn't have to be lengthy, cumbersome, or super comprehensive, unless again there's a cause for concern.
Randall, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up on that question actually, so thank you. First of all, thanks for doing this. This is really interesting and helpful.
Of course.
On the baseline exams, are we effectively getting baseline measurements because of the testing that we're doing in this study? I don't know, what we'll have access to ultimately from that, or do we need to kind of go beyond that to get this baseline measurement? And then my real question, I guess, that I've been dwelling on is with MCI, what is the typical pathway? Is that the kind of thing that is maybe kind of consistently progress? I mean, maybe at an escalating pattern, or is there some kind of oscillation in that? You may go through periods of worsening and then maybe getting better before you maybe start, and I'm interested in the time path of that too, into more serious cognitive impairment.
Absolutely. To your first question, yes. So the initial testing that you did would constitute as a baseline because you didn't receive this was pre any type of education, coaching, etc. Material. And so that could be a great way post the study you can certainly ask for your scores. We can provide that to you. So you have a pretty good indication in terms of where you are for various cognitive aspects. To your second question, mild cognitive impairment is it's a funny impairment because there's a lot that we know, but so much more that we don't. In terms of mild cognitive impairment, to your point, it is very dynamic, meaning you could be perfectly fine, normal, typical cognitive aging, and then maybe your medication for your heart the dosage has increased, or maybe you lost a loved one suddenly. Certain triggers, certain life events could impact your cognition, but temporarily. But even in that time, you would still or could be diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment. In terms of mild cognitive impairment then transitioning or developing into Alzheimer's disease, about 10% or so of those diagnosed with MCI would go on to actually have Alzheimer's disease. So it's one of those things where it's not guaranteed that just because you get a diagnosis of MCI that you're going to automatically have Alzheimer's. So I hope that I alleviate some concerns surrounding that there are a multitude of reasons why you can have MCI, but it's not a death sentence, if you will, in terms of getting or developing Alzheimer's disease. And I will say with mild cognitive impairment, the funny thing about it is it's a lot of different reasons why your cognition can be impacted. More often than not, I'll say it's temporary. It's due to some type of life event, some of the examples that I gave, but there is, as I mentioned, a percentage that it becomes a more permanent and more severe impact.
Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah. And Sandy.
Yes, I'm sorry, I have lots of questions. So there is a family history of Alzheimer's. My grandmother, my aunt, and my mother, who's dementia, she's 92. She still lives alone with a daily caregiver. But where it didn't manifest itself until I'd say 4 to 5 years ago. So I don't really consider that she has Alzheimer's because she's still independent. But it has been suggested that where it manifests itself most is in her loss of language, her inability to pick a word. It's been suggested that for her to receive some speech therapy would help that. And could you speak to how the broader impact of speech therapy might affect some of the other symptoms of dementia? Help me understand that better.
Yeah, absolutely, Sandy. And I love a question about speech pathology because I don't get it often. So I'll take my neuropsych hat off and I'll put my speech pathologist hat on. So speech therapists actually play what I would call a significant role in the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, particularly those who, unfortunately, unlike your mother, is in nursing homes or assisted living facilities, etc. So the best way to describe Alzheimer's is almost like for those who know the movie reference, is almost like a Benjamin Button kind of progression where you start to lose some of what we think are like primitive aspects of us as humans. So it might start out with memory and problem solving, some of those more complex cognitive processes. Then it starts to expand to language, so the inability to express your basic wants, your needs. Then it progresses even more to the point where you forget the process of swallowing, chewing, and things of that nature, in which a speech language pathologist helps to treat all of those things. In terms of what that treatment looks like and how it impacts the other processes, the first part of that is rehabilitation. Is there anything that we can get back? Knowing that it is a progressive disease and at some point we can't, that is our first line of defense. From there, we do compensation. So we provide things like memory aids, calendars, scrapbooks, things like that to help trigger memory, trigger language, so flashcards and the like. And then the third thing is, once we're past that point of compensation, education, and this is more towards the caregivers, nursing aides, etc. So when that person just does not have the skill or the ability to do certain things, what educational pieces can we provide? How to set up the house in a way that is going to reduce the likelihood of falls, having different things laid out so there's not a lot of emphasis on, in your case, your mother's need to express certain things via language. Can she point at things? Can she sign things? Can you set up a routine so that she knows what to expect and isn't frightened by change in routine and doesn't require the need to have to express herself as much as needed if she was independent? Speech therapists often work with occupational therapists, physical therapists, and psychologists to make sure that the environment, the emphasis on environment for those who are in the later stage of Alzheimer's, is appropriate for their level of cognition. So I would say the psychologist really primarily works on the initial end of that assessment, that evaluation. And then if there's a psychiatrist involved or a physician involved in terms of the medication aspect, speech therapists and other rehabilitation therapists like occupational and physical really come in at the treatment aspect in terms of environment, caregiver education, as well as trying to compensate for some of those processes that have been impacted. That was a long-winded answer, but I hope I did actually answer your question, Sandy.
Yeah. She has an appointment in April, and that's one of the things I've asked the doctor to address is possibly getting her some speech therapy.
Yes, absolutely. If there's an opportunity to do so, even if it's just education, I think it's very valuable. And that's my biased and unbiased opinion.
All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Jennifer, I know we're at time and I wish we could talk longer about this. Maybe we'll have to have you back as a guest again. This has been so informative. You've really shared with us such quality knowledge that you have and really given us that reason to have hope and optimism. And thank you so much. Everyone, I'm sure that you want to give her an applaud. we're just so grateful to have you here, to be able to learn from you today. And everyone, we appreciate you showing up, for participating. You make these sessions so valuable to us. We're always interested in hearing your feedback. And if you have ideas for more topics, maybe even for Jennifer, please let me know. We're all ears.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate your time. I know it's invaluable. So the fact that you were willing to spend time with me today and have this conversation. Natalie, to you, the compliments are endless. Just appreciate you facilitating this and generating such very insightful and important questions. So thank you to you all.
Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.